Good evening. We are on our next lecture of the biblical prophets, and our topic as we go and discuss the laws, the story of Joshua, is to first take a step back and to understand what exactly is the mission that is being asked of Joshua and the children of Israel. Now, this is a very difficult one. In fact, I would say it's one of the most challenging moral issue in relating to the laws, the commandments of the Bible. It's on par with the Abrahamic law or command to sacrifice his son, when certain mitzvot, certain commandments seem to defy our sense of morality. What do we do when there's a clash between what the Torah says we should do and between what we think as a society is the right thing to do? There are, let me lay out the issues, and then we can discuss some of the suggestions, and I'll tell you from the outset that none of them come out to be perfectly easy to digest. It's a complicated question, and sometimes part of Judaism, and certainly reading the Bible, is to live with those. We see this as a divine work, and therefore it's a little complicated for us to be so filled with ourselves and convinced that we know better than the Tanakh. But at the same time, we have to recognize that the Tanakh, the Bible, is thousands of years old. So how do you find that proper balance? The question is as follows. The children of Israel are commanded to kill everyone in all the 7 nations in the land of Israel. It's very clearly stated in the Torah in Deuteronomy 7, verses 1 to 6. When God brings you to the land that you're going to inherit, and He's going to dislodge many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, 7 nations much larger than you. And the Lord your God delivers them to you, and you defeat them. You must doom to their destruction. Now, in English, doom them to destruction. In Hebrew, hacharem tacharim otam, which really means like a complete annihilation. Okay, and then it says even further: grant them no terms, which in Hebrew is do not make a covenant, a brit with them, and you're not allowed to give them anything. Not only that, but verse 3, and now maybe there's a little bit of an inkling as to what this is going towards. Why is there such a harsh command here? You shall not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons. Now, why is this? Why do you have to go? And we understand why you can't marry their children. I mean, that's intermarriage, right? So intermarriage is a verse in the Bible, okay? Very clearly stated. This is a very, very bad thing, intermarriage. Why? Look at verse 4. For they will turn your children away from me to worship other gods. And the Lord's anger will blaze forth against you, and he will promptly wipe you out. So what's the process? The process is destroy them. If you don't destroy them, you will end up marrying them. You will end up making a covenant with them. You will give them stuff. You will have a relationship with them. Then you will end up marrying them. And they will turn you astray and worship idols, and then God will destroy you. Okay, that's the equation. Therefore, verse 5, instead, what you should do to them is tear down their altars and smash their pillars and cut down their sacred posts and consign their images to fire. Why? Because you are a people consecrated to God. And of all the peoples on the earth, you are chosen to be God's special treasure. This is a very, very difficult sequence. It not only involves seeming genocide, but it also involves destroying other religions. But we have to put things in perspective. We have to understand this is not just multiculturalism. Your religion is okay, my religion is okay. This is biblical. And in the Bible, there was one God, and there still is one God, and then there's idolatry. And idolatry, according to the Bible, is infested with immorality. And therefore, there's no wiggle room here. If you're keep the idolatry with you, then you will become immoral and you will end up straying away from God. If you, therefore, you must destroy the idolatry and you must destroy the people that go along with them. Wow. That seems to imply men, women, and children. That seems to imply everyone in the nations. That's the straight out verses in the beginning of Dvarim. And the Sefer HaChinuch, which is a book written around 800 years ago, one of the rabbis explaining why this is the case. He says that the roots of the commandment are that these nations have commenced to serve idols and commit many sins, which are abominations before God, and God despises. And therefore, we're commanded to annihilate them from under the heavens. Annihilation is a big word, and certainly for Jews in the 20th century, 21st century, these are hard to swallow. And we have to try to understand. In ancient times, it was evident, and it was in the Middle Ages, it was understood. But how do we understand this in the modern era? The Sefer HaChinuch continues, and he says, once again, we can't go down the path of idolatry. So he asks, well, then why were they created if they were going to be all idolatrous? And then he reverts to the famous point that we are all familiar with, that we have free will. And these people, these nations, did not take advantage of their free will to accept the one God. And therefore, they are evil and then they deserve to die. This commandment applies to both men and women in all places at all times. Of course, practically today, it's not a practical question, because we know that already from Maimonides' time, 800 years ago, Maimonides concluded, and this is from the Talmud, that the nations of the 7 nations were all confused and all mixed up and were lost, and therefore were not be able to point a finger and say, oh, I know who they are, they must be destroyed. The same laws apply to Amalek, that we have a commandment to kill everyone from Amalek. But we don't know who Amalek is anymore, and therefore practically it's not a question, but philosophically it is a question. Philosophically, is the Torah telling me today that my obligation is to annihilate this people, something that is anathema to Jewish sensibility, to anyone's sensibility, to human sensibility? How do we understand this? There's a lot written about this because this is such a challenging topic, okay? And I'm not really I'll just give a few short sources and directions of how we should think about when the text and our morality clash, okay? One way is to explain, and this is very, very important, okay? Here's something that we need to always understand. There are 2 Torahs. There's not one Torah. One Torah is written. It's written in stone. It's written thousands of years ago. It's a divine word. But there's a second Torah. The second Torah is living. It's an updating version. It's a constant check. It's a tradition, a Masorah. It's the oral law. And through every generation, there's an interpretation. And therefore, that with one without the other is impossible. You can't have one without the other. Torah shebechtav, Torah sheba'al peh. You need both in order to understand Jewish law in the 21st century and philosophical understandings of how we read the Bible. The Talmud, despite the fact that the text, there's a debate as to how you can read the text, but the Talmud takes a different stance. The Talmud tries to explain. Jack Abramowitz is a rabbi from the OU, and he writes it in a concise paragraph, and he says there were 7 Canaanite nations, but they were given an option, 3 in fact, as to when the Jews were going to inherit the land. Listen, the Jews, God said, this is my land, and I'm giving it to the Jewish people. Now you who are living here, you have 3 possibilities. You could either leave, right? So that's one way to deal with it. The third option is to fight, okay, and then be killed. So those are two options that are less ideal. But there's a middle option here that is developed by the Ramban, by Nachmanides, based on a verse later on in the Bible, in the end of Devarim, that you're supposed to call out in peace. Who's supposed to call out in peace? The Israelites. When they get to they get to a nation, they call out in peace. Now, what does peace mean? So if you look at number 2, it says they could agree to, that the nation has to agree to adhere to the 7 Noahide laws and submit to Jewish rule. In other words, according to this approach, you don't have an obligation to smite man, woman, and child unless they're not willing to do 2 of the 3 options. One option is leave if you want to continue to be an idolater, because the land of Israel is a place for holiness and God. The second option is stay. The second option is stay, but change from a polytheistic society to a monotheistic society. You don't have to go convert to Judaism, but you do have to accept Jewish rule and follow the basic Noahide laws. The third option is destruction, okay? So I see this, I hear it. This is something that is commonly referred to. The text in Devarim doesn't really, as I see it, refer to these 7 nations. The 7 nations are special. They're supposed to be really destroyed. But maybe the Talmud is saying, or at least one perspective of the Talmud is saying, well, it says it's about anyone other than the 7 nations, but we include the 7 nations. If we accept that, we have a pretty much smoother perspective on how Joshua is supposed to deal with this conquest. Conquest doesn't mean destruction. Conquest means get to the land and offer them an alternative. Now, what's fascinating is that we have an alternative. Who's the alternative? Rachav. Here's Rachav. We assume that, right? She says, we know God is the true God. We want to live next to you in peace. And everyone else in Jericho said no. But at least there is a precedent that the Tanakh is telling us, look, we have personalities, nation groups, maybe even nations that say we want to live here in peace, following the basic rules of monotheism, and then we're able to do it. This is a much more palatable answer. There is an alternative, though. The alternative is a little tricky, but here's how it works, okay? The conquest of the land of Israel, the inheriting of the land of Israel was foretold to Abraham thousands of years ago, hundreds and hundreds of years before Joshua. And Abraham is told the following: you should know that your great-grandchildren are going to be slaves in the land far away from Canaan for 400 years. And you should know that it's going to take them that long to return to the land. Already 4 generations later, they'll only return. Why is there a necessity for the Jewish people to live outside of the land? And God answers, for the iniquity of the Amorites won't be complete until that time. Which means that the reason that the Amorites, and by extension the nations of Canaan, are going to be destroyed is because they are violating the word of God. And God is telling a prophecy that he is going to, unless they change, maybe they repent, but otherwise he is going to destroy them. God gets to destroy people because if you follow the word of God or if you don't follow the word of God. By the way, the same thing happens to the Israelites. Israelites live in the land of Israel, and everything's going fine until they start sinning. What happens? Come along the Babylonians, and they destroy them and take over the land. And then come the Persians and do the same. Then come the Greeks, and come the Romans. So we understand that this is God's land. God chooses to have people living in this land. And if they sin against him, he has someone else come and crush them and send them out of the land. And the vehicles of God's desire are sometimes the Persians and sometimes the Babylonians and sometimes the Israelites. So according to this approach, when Joshua is commanded to annihilate the Canaanites, man, woman, and child, it is because they are part of their idolatrous, evil, immoral ways, and they need to be destroyed as per God's will through the instrument of the Israelites. I say this, once again, not a simple point, because then all of a sudden everyone becomes a freedom fighter for their God. And then who's to determine what's moral if everyone is, killing in the name of God? It's a complicated answer, but nevertheless one. So just to conclude, the first approach, I didn't even mention, but it's the one made famous by the Chazon Ish, which says God's morality reigns supreme. Don't think that you're better than God. Don't think you're more moral than God. Today even, the Bible says what it says, and our understanding of morality is from the Bible, and therefore we can't have anything extra that is different from how the Bible presented it. That's a harsh, very, very strict view, and it says there's no wiggle room. Whatever the Bible says is perfect. The second approach is the Ramban. There's no immorality here because there was always the offering of peace, and therefore they can choose if they want to be destroyed or not. The third one, which I just mentioned, is that there's no immorality because these nations were sinful and were being destroyed. And it happens to be that Israel and Joshua, as we're about to learn, are the instruments of that destruction. The fourth one is one that's not orthodox. The position that's not orthodox is that God's command then was immoral. And it's immoral for then, and it's immoral now, and therefore that is not an orthodox position, because we say we start from the perspective of God's divine. We start of God's perfection. So we can't go and then turn it around and say, well, God is wrong or God is immoral. Okay? So this is what I wanted to start with, and now I want to jump into the text with chapter 6. And chapter 6 is the conquest of Jericho. Now, I want to tell you that the first conquest, which really should be the model, the prototype for all conquests, is very, very clearly divine. The point of the conquest is that every person who goes into the army is ready to fight and give up their lives, but if they're following the ways of God, then they're going to be successful, and they're going to defeat their enemy. And this we see very, very clearly in the story of Jericho. Right? We start in verse 1. Jericho was closed off. It had a huge wall. It had a huge gate, and it was really fortified. And of course, remember, Joshua had already sent spies, so he knew a little about it. So how is he going to do it? How is he going to get it? In ancient times, everyone had these major walls and fortified cities. And they had, they're almost impenetrable. Well, they're not impenetrable if you have God on your side. Here is the command. God says to Joshua, verse 3, march around the city. Do it one circle every day for 6 days. And then on the seventh day, with seven priests carrying 7 rams' horns, and on the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the horns. And when a long blast is sounded on the horn, all the people shall give a mighty shout, and the city wall will collapse, and the people will advance, every man straight ahead. This is a miracle, all right? This is part of our understanding of how the conquest began and really should have continued to take place, was in a miraculous style. Therefore, God goes and instructs them. No chiseling, no battering rams, no huge major pillars to build and to pilasters to throw. No, the walls will fall. The walls will come tumbling down. Okay, that's exactly what happened in verse 6. It tells everyone to do that. In verse 7, they go and they surround, and they blow the shofars, and they go and they make a big noise, and they weren't allowed to make noise until it was the right time. And this is the rest of a large part of the chapter is that they actually go and they do this. And on the seventh day, they rose at daybreak, verse 15. They marched around the 7 times. On the 7th round, they blew the shofars. And what happened? Verse 17. The city and everything in it are to be prescribed for the Lord, which means God is saying the first conquest is mine. You're not allowed to take anything. The only things that are allowed to be left alive are Rachav Hazonah and all of her wealth and all of her family. Okay? And everything else is not to be spared. That means that you can't take the animals, and you can't take the gold, and you can't take the silver, and you can't take the children, you can't take the slaves. This belongs to God. Now, this is important for the next chapters, so let's just remember that there is a general idea in the Bible that the first thing goes to God. Okay? The first thing goes to God, meaning that you give to God the first fruit, the first animal, sometimes the firstborn child. You have to recognize that that you're giving of yourself. Chala, everything first goes to God, and this is the first conquest. So the first conquest goes to God, and that's called cherem. All right, cherem means no one's allowed to touch it. Well, what happens? And it repeats itself in verse 19. All the silver and golden objects of copper and iron are consecrated to the Lord. They must go into the treasury of the Lord. So the people shouted when the horns were sounded. The people heard the horns. People raised a mighty shout, and the wall collapsed. The people rushed in the city, and they captured the city. And then comes verse 21, which is the verse that we talk about. They exterminated, and that's the harsh word that we have to use. Okay, bayacharimu. Everything in the city with the sword, man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep and ass. But verse 22, Joshua told the 2 spies to go into the harlot's house and bring out the woman Rachav. According to the Midrash, Joshua ends up marrying Rachav. Nice idea, but the text doesn't tell us this. So they destroy the whole city. And then in verse 26, only Rachav, the harlot, and her family were spared because she did this kindness to the Jewish people. And in verse 26, Joshua made a curse. He cursed anyone who rebuilds the city. This is the end of, and it says, Bivchoro yisadeno v'tziro yatziv lateh. He shall lay its foundations at the cost of his firstborn. Anyone who does it, they're going to lose their firstborn child, and set up its gates at the cost of his youngest. It was as if a statement to all the nations that this land will never be rebuilt. Of course, subsequently, it was rebuilt. It was rebuilt throughout history, most notably in ancient times. I think in Herodian times and in Hasmonean period, And by the, certainly in the Muslim period, there's a famous, and there's an ancient synagogue there. So that's nevertheless what happened in the story of this chapter 6. But something went wrong. They followed everything to a T. They followed all of God's commands, except for one person. And here's a fascinating discussion about the individual and the community, and about an important lesson that the Bible teaches us called Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Lazeh. All Israelites are responsible to each other. Now, responsible is not even a strong enough word. They are obligated to each other, such that if one sins, perhaps the rest might endure the pain and the suffering as a result of it. Let's see what happens in chapter 7. Vayimalu. Vayimalu means when you take something from God. Okay? Israelites violated the prescription. One person named Achan. Achan was the one man who couldn't help himself. He saw the booty, he saw the gold and the silver, and he took it for himself and his family, perhaps. And therefore, God got angry with Israel. Of course, nobody knew. But the Tanakh, right, is telling us in prophecy here that one person did take from the cherem, and as a result, look what happens in the next story, verse 2. Joshua is all excited and very thrilled with how the first mission went, and he continues to the second mission. Joshua sent men from Jericho to the next city, the next fortified city called Ai, which is, and he tells them to go spy. And the men went up and spied. Fantastic, just like the previous one. And they returned to Joshua, and they said, it's a small, unfortified, or not strong city. Don't bother with everyone. 3,000 troops are all we need. Okay, verse 4. 3,000 of the troops marched up there, but they were routed by the men of Ai. The men of Ai killed 36 of them, and everyone else ran away. What happened? You're with God. You're supposed to be invincible. And in verse 5, the men of Ai, at the end of it, it says, and the heart of the troops of the Israelites sank or melted in utter dismay. Which means that they didn't understand what could possibly go wrong. If you have God on your side and you're following all the laws, and all of a sudden you lose a battle, it doesn't make any sense. And this troubled them. Verse 7. Joshua cries out to God, why have you done this? Why did you bring us into the Jordan? Only to lose, to be killed by the Amorites. And look what happened. The Canaanites hear that, they destroyed them in Jericho, but the next, the small Ai, they defeated them. So God responds, and this is a really good contrast to what happened in the end of the stories of the Bible with the first generation, especially, where God would say, I want to destroy everyone, or where God would get angry and then you would not hear from God, and then the people would rebel against him. None of this happened. This is a mature second generation. And for them, there's a consequence to your camp not being pure. And your consequence is 36 people were killed. But Joshua does the right thing. The people don't rebel. They turn to Joshua. Joshua turns to God. And Joshua says, and God says, get up. Why are you falling on your face? Verse 11, Israel has sinned. Who sinned? One person. But that's not how God sees it. Israel has sinned. You are your brother's keeper. They violated my covenant, which I commanded them. They took from the gold and the silver. They stole. They broke They broke my faith. Therefore, the children of Israel would not be able to defeat the next city. So he says, get up and go sanctify the people and prepare for tomorrow, because there's going to be a reckoning. And you can't go and defeat your enemies until you get rid of this cherem from before you. In other words, someone stole some chalices or some gold or some silver, and you expect that, okay, that person should be punished, but that's not how the system works. The way the system works is you're all responsible for your fellow. And if one person stole, you should have seen it. And if you turned your eyes away and averted, you are part of the problem as well. That's how the organism is supposed to function in its highest level. And everyone has to stand by their tribe, and there's going to be a reckoning. And the one who stole it, he will be burned, and everything with him, for he violated the covenant of God. Well, Joshua hears this. There's no complaining. There's no sweeping soliloquies. There's Joshua understanding there was a mistake. So everyone stood and they found out that it was the tribe of Judah. And then everyone in the tribe of Judah stood up and they found out it was the family of the Zarchi. And then everyone in the Zarchi, until they got to one man, they got to Achan. In other words, biblically or in a divine way, they found the perpetrator. In verse 19, Joshua turns to Achan and he says, my son, pay honor to the Lord, the God of Israel, and make confession to him. Tell me what you have done. Do not hold anything back from me. Think about him saying, my son. This is Joshua's form of leadership. It was one that, even though he's going to get his punishment, but nevertheless, Joshua has a softer touch. And Achan answers him and he says, indeed, I've sinned against the Lord. This is what I did. I saw among the spoil a fine mantle, 200 shekels of silver and a wedge of gold weighing 50 shekels. I coveted them and I took them. And I buried it in the ground next to my tent with the silver under it. Well, Joshua sent the messengers to find out exactly, if that's what happened. And Joshua and all of Israel took Achan, when all the silver and the mantle and the wedge of gold and his sons and his daughters, and he brought them to the valley of Achor. And then Joshua had to say something in front of Achan and in front of all, the leaders of Israel. And Joshua said, what calamity you have brought upon us. The Lord will bring calamity upon you on this day. And everyone pelted them with stones. And they put them to the fire and they stoned them. And they put a huge mound of stones over him, which is still there. And the anger of the Lord was abated, was subsided, and this is called the Valley of Achor till this day. Listen, we've already discussed some of the more ancient ways to kill, and this is yet another one. But we're a little more comfortable because this is called divine justice. I guess this is a microcosm of what's going on the bigger scale, right? Achan sins. Who punishes Achan? Sometimes it used to be God, but here it's the people, because the people need to be empowered. In order to create a just society, the people have to be empowered in order to take care of those who are weaker and those who are sinful and those who are troublemakers, in order to help develop the society to advance. And therefore, listen, this is not just in biblical era or in the Bible, but it's in all societies. They all developed a course of justice until recently. And in some countries, they're still doing it, putting people to death. So, in Western countries, they're not doing that. But the idea of justice hasn't gone away. The idea of justice exists. It's just that justice in a divine biblical motif and era, that's when sinning against God, and therefore the punishment will be what needs to be done. in society, so society gets together and they create a social contract. And they're saying, if you violate, you run a red light, you need to be punished so that we can protect the integrity of society. And we have a police force to prevent chaos and looting and riots. And but they have to be balanced and they have to be checked. And it's a very, very, they can't be filled with themselves, and they can't have too much power either. This is how societies have to work. In ancient Israel, it worked a similar way. There were policemen, there were people who adjudicated, there were judges, there were prophets, and there was everything. And there was God, who had kind of like, had the ultimate knowledge and said, there's something wrong that you don't know, Joshua. You need to fix this. This then becomes the kind of like the motto or the model of how this nation is going to conquer. Either they conquer as one organism, or they're going to fail. Either they conquer with God at their side, or they're going to be destroyed. Either they conquer by following Joshua, who's following Moses' footsteps, or there's going to be disaster. And we see in chapter 8 the tikkun, which means they fixed what went awry. And God turns to Joshua and says, don't fear. Don't be concerned. Go back and fight I. Now, whenever God says or anyone says don't, so we can assume that they were, right? Joshua must have been beside himself. Here he's flying high in Jericho and feeling great and following the ways of God. And all of a sudden, very confused that there's a loss. So there's 36 wives came to him and say, why do I not have a husband if we're supposed to be following the ways of God? I don't have a great answer. Joshua didn't either. Joshua turns to God, and God says, this is collateral damage for one that you didn't watch over. That's also complicated. Therefore, Joshua is depressed, filled with despair. And God says, don't be so upset. Don't be so filled with despair. There's a way to move on, and this is what you need to do. So I have now given you the king of Ai, and you will do to Ai what you did to Jericho, with one caveat, with one change. Here you're allowed to take the spoils for yourself. And the way you should do it is you should make an ambush in the city. So Joshua and all the fighting troops prepared for march on Ai, and he chose 30,000 men. And he instructed them as follows: lie in ambush in the city, don't go too far, and Ai troops will come from one direction, and the people will be drawn out, and then you'll go out in, and this is a famous strategy of Joshua, and this is studied in armies and all different types of techniques that were used, going all the way back, the art of war, and Joshua does this. And what happens is the army thinks that Israel is running away, so they run out. They turn around and they see their city is on fire, and then they are in a very chaotic state. And that's exactly what happens. That they take 5,000 men, station them to ambush between Beit El and Ai. And the main part of the body of the army was disposed in the north of the city. And when the king of Ai saw, they rushed out and they're really facing their Avad to engage the Israelites in battle. Right? He didn't know that there was someone lying in wait, as we say. And Joshua and all of Israel fled in directions. They ran away, and the troops ran after them. And no one was left in the city of Ai. And then the Lord turned to Joshua and he said, hold out the javelin in your hand towards Ai, for I will deliver it in your hands. And Joshua did so. And as soon as he held out his hand, the ambush came rushing. They entered the city and captured it and swiftly set fire to the city. And when the men saw that was happening, they They had no room for flight in any direction. For when Joshua and all Israel saw that the ambush had captured the city, and the smoke was rising from the city, they turned around and attacked the men on Ai, and the other Israelites came out the city against them, and they were slaughtered, and no one escaped, and no one got away. Although the king of Ai was taken alive and brought before Joshua. When Israel had killed all the inhabitants of Ai who had pursued them in the open wilderness to the last man, and everyone fell by the sword, the total of those who fell that day, men and women, the entire population of Ai, came to 12,000. They allowed themselves to take some of the profits from the city, and they burnt it to the ground and made it into a tell until today. We generally haven't seen a rebuilding of Ai. What did they do to the king of Ai? He was impaled on a stake until the evening. At sunset, Joshua had the corpse taken down, and they buried him and raised a heap of stones over it, which is there until this day. There's a verse in the Bible that even if it's your enemy, you're not allowed to leave them impaled for more than that day. That day is a message to, I guess, the other armies, but it is still a creature of God, and the body is not to be mutilated and left to the birds. Okay, so therefore Joshua took them down. In verse 30, Joshua builds a mizbeach, an altar. In the next class, I'm going to bring some pictures of the altar of Joshua, and we'll discuss a little bit about archaeology, because one man named Adam Zartal is convinced that he found this altar, which is pretty cool. If you go to Har Ebal and you can hold a Tanakh, a Bible in your hands, and you're able to try to find. This is the genre called biblical archaeology, which was started by a Christian named William F. Albright in the 19th century. Verse 30, Joshua built an altar to God as an expression of gratitude, and as Moses had commanded the Israelites. It had to be an altar of unhewn stone. Can't use metal. No iron. And they offered their burnt offerings to the Lord and brought sacrifices. And there on the stones, and this is once again reminding us of what it means to be a warrior in the army of God. There on the stones, he inscribed a copy of the Torah that Moses gave to the Israelites. Mishneh Torat Moshe. And all Israel, stranger and citizen alike, the elders, officials, and magistrates stood on the side of the ark, facing the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant. And half of them faced Mount Gerizim, and half of them faced Mount Ebal. And Moses was standing in the middle, and he read all the words of the Torah, the blessings and the curses, as we saw previously in the Torah, which I will remind us about. And there was not a word of all that Moses had commanded that Joshua failed to read in the presence of the entire assembly of Israel, including the men and the children and the strangers who accompanied them. And this is how we conclude. This is really the first mini section of the book of Joshua. And next week, we will start to talk a little bit about biblical archaeology, and then we will continue on along our class to the next chapters. Thank you very much, and I wish you all a good